Rain hammered the window like it had something personal against the glass. Ella stood there frozen in the hallway, her fist hovering inches from the door, the weight of the evening pressing down on her chest until it hurt to breathe. She had not planned this. Not at 2 in the morning. But the words from her ex still echoed, sharp as shattered porcelain. And the silence of her own apartment felt like drowning. She knocked anyway. Soft at first. Then harder. Because what else was there? The door creaked open. And Grace blinked into the dim light. Her blonde hair tangled from sleep. Eyes wide with that mix of concern and confusion that made her look younger than her 32 years. Ella. What's wrong? It was not a question. Not really. Grace stepped aside. And Ella stumbled in. The scent of chamomile tea and old books wrapping around her like a reluctant hug. The apartment was a mirror of her own. Down to the mismatched furniture scavenged from thrift stores in Capitol Hill. But Grace had made it hers with stacks of dog-eared novels on every surface and a single potted fern thriving against all Seattle odds. Ella collapsed onto the worn couch. Her hands twisting in her lap. And the story spilled out before she could stop it. The breakup. The lies. The way Sarah had packed her bags that afternoon. Casual as folding laundry. And left without a backward glance. Grace listened without interrupting. Perched on the arm of the chair across from her. Legs tucked under like she was bracing for a storm. When Ella finally trailed off. Voice cracking on the last syllable. Grace sighed. A long, weary sound that seemed to carry the rain outside with it. Come here. She slid down beside her. Close enough that their knees brushed. And handed over a mug of tea that had appeared from nowhere. Steam curling up like a question mark. They talked then. Or rather. Ella talked and Grace nodded. Her presence a steady anchor in the choppy sea of words. It started with the small things. The way Sarah had always left dishes in the sink. Stacking up like unspoken resentments. But it unraveled into the bigger hurts. The nights Ella had lain awake wondering if love was just a polite way of saying tolerance. Grace shared bits of her own history in return. Careful fragments about a college girlfriend who had vanished into the arms of a safer life. Back in Ohio before she fled to the West Coast for good. I thought I could fix her, Grace said. Staring into her own mug as if it held answers. But you can't fix what doesn't want to be whole. The clock on the wall ticked past 3. Then 4. The rain easing into a persistent drizzle that tapped out a rhythm against the world. Ella felt the exhaustion settling in her bones. But there was something addictive about this. The way Grace's voice wrapped around her doubts. Soft and sure. Like she had been waiting for this conversation all along. They moved to the kitchen eventually. Because sitting still felt too raw. And Grace pulled out a half-empty bottle of red wine from the fridge. Pouring it into mismatched glasses with a shrug. For the nerves, she said. And they clinked them together. The sound small but defiant in the quiet. As the wine warmed her from the inside. Ella found herself studying Grace in stolen glances. The way her laugh lines crinkled when she recounted a disastrous parent-teacher conference. Or how her fingers drummed lightly on the counter when she paused to think. Grace was the kind of beautiful that snuck up on you. Not flashy but earned. Like the freckles dusting her nose from too many summer hikes in the Cascades. Ella had noticed her before. Of course. In the laundry room downstairs with her arms full of student essays. Or waving from the balcony with a quick hello that lingered just a second too long. But tonight. In the low light of the pendant lamp. She saw the weariness beneath it all. The quiet strength that came from carrying too much alone. You know, Grace said after a while. Leaning against the sink with her glass half empty. Sometimes the end of something is just the universe clearing space. For what comes next? Her eyes met Ella's. Steady and searching. And for a moment the air between them thickened. Charged with the unsaid. Ella's heart stuttered. A flutter low in her stomach that had nothing to do with the wine. She looked away first. Tracing the grain of the wooden floor with her toe. Because looking too long felt dangerous. Like stepping off a ledge without checking the drop. They drifted back to the living room as dawn hinted at the edges of the curtains. Gray light seeping in like an uninvited guest. Grace pulled a blanket from the back of the couch. Draping it over both their legs as they settled in side by side. The space between them shrinking with every shared breath. Ella leaned her head against the cushion. Eyes heavy. And murmured. I don't know how to start over. Not again. Grace's hand found hers under the fabric, fingers intertwining with a gentleness that stole the air from the room. "One word at a time," she whispered. "That's how we got here." By the time the first real light broke through, painting the walls in soft golds, Ella realized she had not thought of Sarah in hours. The ache was still there, a bruise blooming under her ribs, but it felt distant now, softened by the warmth of Grace's shoulder against hers. They sat like that until the city woke around them, horns blaring faintly from the street below, and Ella wondered, not for the first time that night, what it would be like to stay. The morning unfolded lazy and unhurried, coffee brewing in Grace's ancient percolator while Ella patted around in borrowed socks that were too big, the fabric bunching at her ankles. They ate toast at the small table by the window, butter melting slow under the strengthening sun, and talked about nothing and everything. Grace's job came up. The endless cycle of grading papers on Hawthorne and Whitman. The kids who lit up her days and the ones who dimmed them. "There's this one girl, Mia," she said, smiling into her cup. 16 and already writing poetry that cuts deeper than anything I've read in years. Makes me remember why I do it." Ella nodded, envying that purpose even as she shared her own world of deadlines and digital sketches. The freelance grind that paid the rent but left her soul scraping for color. "I design logos for startups that fold in 6 months," she admitted, crumbling a crust between her fingers. "Feels like building sandcastles at high tide." Grace reached across the table, her touch light on Ella's wrist. "Then build something that lasts. For you." It was that simple. That terrifying. The conversation meandered to plans. Half-formed dreams Grace had of road-tripping down the coast once summer break hit. Chasing lighthouses and forgotten diners along Highway 101. Ella listened, picturing it. The wind in her hair and the Pacific stretching endless blue. And before she knew it, the words were out. "Take me with you." Grace's eyes widened, then softened, a slow smile curving her lips. "Yeah. I will." They parted reluctantly that afternoon, Ella lingering in the doorway with a promise to text later. The hallway suddenly too empty as the door clicked shut. Back in her own apartment, the silence roared back. But it was different now, laced with possibility. She curled up on her bed, phone clutched in her hand, and replayed the night in fragments. The way Grace's laugh had bubbled up unexpected, or the steady rise and fall of her breathing as they dozed off tangled in conversation. Days blurred into a tentative rhythm after that. Texts pinged back and forth. Silly memes about rainy commutes and late-night cravings for pho from the spot on Broadway. Ella found herself lingering outside Grace's door on purpose, pretending to check the mail, heart lifting when Grace appeared with a wave and that easy grin. One evening, after a particularly brutal client call that left Ella pacing her living room like a caged animal, she knocked again. Grace opened the door in paint-splattered overalls, her hair tied back with a bandana, and pulled her inside without a word. The apartment smelled of turpentine and fresh canvas. A half-finished landscape propped on an easel in the corner. All swirling greens of the Olympic Peninsula. "Hobby," Grace explained, wiping her hands on a rag. "Keeps me sane when words fail." They ordered pizza. Greasy slices devoured on the floor amid tubes of oil paint and dog-eared sketchbooks. And Ella confessed the fear that gnawed at her. The worry that she was broken goods. Unlovable in the wreckage of her last relationship. Grace set her slice down. Serious now. And cupped Ella's face in both hands. "You're not wreckage. You're a story still unfolding." The kiss happened then. Inevitable as the tide. Grace leaning in slow, giving Ella every chance to pull away. But she didn't. Ella met her halfway. Lips soft and tentative at first, then deepening with the hunger of all the nights she had spent alone. Grace tasted like pepperoni and possibility, her hands threading through Ella's hair, pulling her closer until the world narrowed to the press of bodies and the quiet gasp that escaped when they broke apart. They tumbled to the rug, laughter mixing with sighs, clothes shedding in a trail from the living room to the bedroom, where the sheets tangled around them like conspirators. It was messy and real. Bodies learning each other in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. Grace's whispers against Ella's skin a litany of affirmations she had not known she needed. Afterward, they lay spent and sated, limbs entwined, the ceiling fan stirring the air lazy above them. Ella traced patterns on Grace's arm, The curve of her elbow. The faint scar from a childhood bike crash. "What now?" she murmured, voice thick with the afterglow. Grace turned her head, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Now we see." But seeing meant facing the shadows. The next week brought a storm of its own. Not rain but revelations. Sarah texted out of the blue. An apology laced with excuses. Asking to meet for coffee like nothing had shattered. Ella stared at the screen in the break room at her co-working space, stomach churning, and deleted it without replying. Grace found her later that evening, curled on the balcony with a sketchpad untouched. And they walked it out together. Down to Pike Place where the market buzzed with tourists and the salt air off the Sound. Under the shadow of the public market sign. Amid the clamor of fishmongers tossing salmon and the sweet tang of crepes from street carts. Grace bought them hot cider from a vendor with a gap-toothed smile. They wandered the stalls. Fingers laced. Ella's tension easing with every step. Until they found a bench overlooking the water. Ferries cutting white wakes across the gray expanse. "You did good," Grace said, bumping her shoulder. "Letting go isn't failure. It's freedom." Ella leaned into her, the cider warming her palms. And for the first time in months, the future felt less like a threat and more like an invitation. Summer crept in on tentative wings. The Seattle gloom lifting just enough to tease with blue skies and longer days. Ella and Grace fell into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Mornings tangled in sheets before Grace rushed off to lesson plans. Evenings where Ella's laptop stayed closed as they cooked haphazard meals in whichever kitchen was cleaner. It was easy, this thing between them. But ease bred its own fears. Whispers in the quiet hours when doubt crept in like fog off the bay. One Saturday, they drove out to Discovery Park. The city shrinking in the rearview as the road wound through neighborhoods thick with rhododendrons in bloom. Grace handled the wheel of her battered Subaru. Radio tuned to some indie station crooning about lost loves. While Ella fiddled with a playlist on her phone, adding tracks that made her think of stolen glances and midnight confessions. The park unfolded in layers of forest and bluff. Trails snaking under cedars that towered like silent guardians. The sound of waves crashing below a constant underscore. They hiked the loop trail. Backpacks light with water and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Sweat beading on their skin in the unaccustomed heat. Grace pointed out birds she knew by call. A varied thrush's trill slicing through the underbrush. And Ella sketched quick lines in her notebook, capturing the play of light on moss-covered rocks. At the overlook, they spread a blanket on the grass, the Olympic mountains jagged against the horizon, and unpacked their lunch. Turkey on rye with slices of sharp cheddar that stuck to the roof of the mouth. Conversation flowed light at first. Stories from Grace's week with a student who had aced her essay on The Great Gatsby, the green light across the bay, a metaphor that hit too close for comfort. Ella shared a win. A client who loved her rebrand for a local bookstore. The logo a stylized open book with pages unfurling like wings. But as the sun climbed higher, arcing toward noon, the words turned deeper. Grace admitting the pull of her family back east. The annual 4th of July barbecue in Cleveland that she skipped every year since coming out at 22. "My mom's calls are all surface," she said, picking at a blade of grass, her voice carrying the weight of oceans. Weather updates and recipes for pierogies. But underneath, it's there. The question she never asks. Ella watched her, the way her jaw tightened just a fraction, and reached for her hand, lacing their fingers over the blanket's edge. "You don't have to go back. Not for them." Grace's eyes met hers. Stormy green flecked with gold in the light. And she squeezed back. "I know. But sometimes I wonder what it would be like. To show up as me. All of me." The vulnerability hung between them, fragile as the spiderwebs strung between ferns. And Ella felt her own ghost stirring. She had not told Grace about the letters from her father in Portland. The ones that arrived like clockwork every birthday. Postmarked from a man who had walked out when she was 12. Leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills and unanswered whys. "He writes like nothing happened," she said finally. The words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Like I should just forget." Grace shifted closer, her arm slipping around Ella's waist, pulling her into the solid warmth of her side. They sat like that until the shadows lengthened. The park emptying of families with leashed dogs and couples on picnics. The air cooling with the promise of evening. Driving back, windows down to let the salt wind whip through. They sang off-key to a Fleetwood Mac cover. Harmonies clashing but joyful. And Ella thought this might be what healing looked like. Not a straight line but a winding path with someone to share the views. The road trip idea solidified over the next weeks. Maps spread across Grace's coffee table like battle plans. Highlighters marking stops from Seattle to San Francisco. Ella threw herself into it. Researching hidden beaches near Astoria and the redwood groves at Avenue of the Giants. Her excitement a buffer against the creeping anxiety of what this meant. Committing to more than a night or a weekend. Grace sensed it. Of course. Her teacher's intuition sharp as a well-honed pencil. And one evening after a shift at a cafe gig she picked up for extra cash. She came home with a stack of vintage postcards from a shop in Fremont. Visual aids, she announced. Dumping them on the table amid takeout containers of pad thai. Steam rising in lazy curls. They sorted through them after dinner. Images of crumbling missions in Carmel and surf shacks in Crescent City. Each one a portal to what could be. Grace's fingers brushed Ella's as she passed over a card of Big Sur cliffs plunging into turquoise waves. And the touch lingered, sparking that familiar heat low in Ella's belly. Imagine waking up to that, Grace murmured. Her breath warm against Ella's ear. They made love that night on the couch. Urgent and unhurried. The postcards scattering like confetti as bodies pressed close. Grace's hands mapped Ella's curves with reverence. Lips trailing fire down her neck. Across the swell of her breasts. Drawing out gasps that echoed in the quiet room. Ella arched into her. Fingers digging into Grace's shoulders. The world dissolving to the slick slide of skin and the rhythm of shared breaths. When release came, it crashed over them in waves. Leaving them boneless and breathless. Laughter bubbling up as they disentangled from the cushions. In the afterglow, wrapped in a throw blanket that smelled faintly of Grace's lavender soap, Ella voiced the fear that had been gnawing at her edges. What if this is just rebound? For both of us. Grace propped herself on an elbow. Her expression soft but serious. Hair falling like a curtain around her face. Then we call it what it is. And keep going anyway. She traced a finger down Ella's cheek. Thumb brushing her lower lip. Because ending up talking until morning. That wasn't rebound. That was real. The words settled something in Ella. A knot loosening in her chest. And she pulled Grace down for a kiss that tasted of trust. They fell asleep there. The TV flickering some forgotten documentary on national parks. And woke to the patter of rain on the skylight. The trip just days away. Packing became a ritual. Suitcases half filled with sundresses and hiking boots. A cooler stocked with cheeses from the market and bottles of Oregon Pinot. Ella's apartment felt foreign as she locked it up. Subletting to a friend from her design collective for the month. The keys exchanged with a hug that carried all the good luck she could muster. Grace waited in the car. Engine idling. And when Ella slid into the passenger seat. The door shutting with a solid thunk. It felt like crossing a threshold. They left Seattle under a sky heavy with promise. The Space Needle shrinking in the side mirror as they merged onto I-5 South. The first hours passed in comfortable chatter. Grace narrating trivia about the landscape. How the Columbia River had carved its gorge over millennia. While Ella snapped photos from the window. The blur of evergreens giving way to open fields dotted with grazing cows. They stopped in Portland for lunch. Wandering the Pearl District with its murals splashed in vibrant graffiti. Sharing a falafel wrap from a food truck parked under string lights. Portland suited them. All hipster charm and hidden bookstores stacked to the rafters with queer lit and zines. In one, Powell's City of Books. They lost hours among the shelves. Grace pulling volumes of Mary Oliver poetry while Ella hunted graphic novels with strong female leads. They emerged blinking into the afternoon sun. Arms laden with bags. And found a park bench near the Willamette. Feeding crumbs from a pretzel to pigeons that strutted like they owned the place. As dusk fell, painting the river in strokes of lavender and rose, Grace turned to her. Voice low. This. You and me and the road. It's more than I hoped for. Ella's throat tightened. Emotion swelling hot behind her eyes. And she leaned in. Foreheads touching. The city's hum fading to a distant roar. Me too. They kissed there. Slow and deep. Uncaring of the joggers passing by or the family picnicking nearby. The world a backdrop to the quiet certainty blooming between them. Night found them in a roadside motel off Highway 26, Neon sign buzzing, vacancy in looping script. The room smelling of pine cleaner and instant coffee. They showered together. Water cascading hot over chilled skin from the evening drive. Hands soaping each other with lazy thoroughness. Laughter echoing off the tiles when soap suds turned to tickles. In bed. Under threadbare sheets. They explored again. Slower this time. Grace's mouth charting paths that left Ella trembling. Her own fingers coaxing sighs from Grace that built like a crescendo. Sleep came deep and dreamless. The hum of semis on the interstate a lullaby. And Ella woke to Grace's arms slung across her waist. Breath warm on her neck. It was perfect. This interlude. But perfection had a way of cracking under pressure. And the first fracture appeared the next morning over motel waffles drowned in syrup. A call from Grace's mother. The screen lighting up with an Ohio area code just as they hit the Oregon coast. The Subaru hugging curves that plunged toward the sea. Grace glanced at it. Jaw setting in that familiar line. And let it go to voicemail. Ella pretended not to notice. Eyes fixed on the map app plotting their route to Cannon Beach. But the air in the car thickened. Charged with the unsaid. They arrived as the tide pulled out. Haystack Rock looming like a sentinel from tide pools teeming with starfish and anemones waving lazy in the shallows. The beach stretched endless. Sand cool and firm underfoot. Gulls wheeling overhead with cries that pierced the wind. They walked barefoot. Pants rolled to the knees. Collecting shells that spiraled in pearlescent whirls. Grace's laughter ringing out when a wave snuck up to soak her hem. But the joy felt forced now. Edges fraying. And over clam chowder at a driftwood shingled cafe perched on the bluff. It spilled over. Your mom, Ella ventured. Stirring her spoon through the creamy broth. Steam rising in question marks. Grace sighed. Setting her bowl down with deliberate care. She wants me to visit. For the holiday. Says Dad's not getting any younger. The words hung. Heavy as the fog rolling in from the Pacific. And Ella reached across the scarred wooden table. Covering Grace's hand with her own. And you? Grace's eyes. When they met hers. Were turbulent. Green depths swirling with conflict. I want to. To show them I'm okay. That I'm happy. She paused. Thumb tracing circles on Ella's knuckles. With you. The admission cracked something open. Raw and real. And Ella felt tears prick. Hot and unbidden. Then go. But come back. They finished the meal in subdued quiet. The clatter of silverware from other tables a distant underscore. And drove onto a campsite near Nikini Mountain. Pitching a tent under a sky-bruising purple. The fire they built crackled tentative at first. Sparks lifting like fireflies into the dusk. And they roasted marshmallows on sticks whittled sharp with a pocket knife. The sugar charring black before melting gooey on their tongues. Grace pulled out her phone eventually. Playing the voicemail on speaker. Her mother's voice tinny and laced with that Midwestern warmth edged in worry. Eleanor Grace. It's Mom. We miss you. Honey. The lake house is rented out this year. But there's always room. Bring someone if you want. Love you. The line went dead. And silence stretched. Broken only by the pop of embers. Grace tossed a stick into the flames. Watching it catch. She used my full name. Means business. Ella scooted closer on the log they shared. Shoulder to shoulder. The heat of the fire warring with the chill seeping from the ground. What would you tell her? About us. Grace turned. Firelight dancing in her eyes. And cupped Ella's face. Drawing her in for a kiss that tasted of smoke and sweetness. That you're the best thing that's happened to me since I learned to read. They made love in the tent. Canvas walls whispering with the wind. Bodies urgent against the thin sleeping pads. Grace's gasps muffled against Ella's neck as pleasure built and broke. It was fierce. A reclaiming. And afterward they lay tangled. The zipper of the sleeping bag half undone to let in the night air scented with salt and pine. The drive south the next day carried them through Tillamook. Where they detoured for ice cream straight from the factory. Cones dripping vanilla flecked with berries as they licked them in the parking lot. Laughing at the mess on their chins. The coast unfolded in postcard perfection. Cliffs sheared vertical into foam-capped waves. Lighthouses blinking from headlands like lonely beacons. They stopped at every pullout. Cameras clicking. But the call lingered like a shadow. Grace's phone silent now but its echo loud. By the time they reached the redwoods. Avenue of the Giants, a cathedral of ancient trunks soaring skyward. The tension had simmered to a boil. They parked and wandered the canopy trail. Boardwalks elevated through branches thick as thighs. Ferns carpeting the forest floor in emerald hush. Sunlight slanted in shafts. Motes dancing like dust in an old attic. And Ella felt the words building. A pressure in her chest she could no longer ignore. "Talk to me," she said. Stopping where the path widened to a platform overlooking a creek gurgling over polished stones. Grace leaned on the railing. Her back to Ella. Shoulders tight under the straps of her day pack. "I'm scared," she admitted. Voice barely above the water's murmur. "Of what they might say. Or not say." Ella stepped up behind her. Arms wrapping around her waist. Chin resting on her shoulder. "You're not that girl anymore. The one who hid." Grace turned in her embrace. Eyes searching. And the kiss that followed was desperate. Hands fisting in fabric as if to anchor against the unknown. They broke apart gasping. Foreheads pressed. The forest holding its breath around them. "Come with me," Grace whispered. "To Ohio. After this." Ella's heart stuttered. The offer a bridge over chasms she had not dared cross. "Yes." The relief in Grace's face was a sunrise. Slow and golden. And they continued the trail hand in hand. The weight lifting with every step. That night in a cabin rental deep in Humboldt. Walls paneled in knotty pine and a stone fireplace crackling welcome. They celebrated with wine from a local vineyard. Bottles clinking in a toast to what-ifs turned to wills. Dinner was pasta tossed with foraged mushrooms from the market in Eureka. Sauce rich with garlic and cream. Eaten cross-legged on the rug before the flames. Conversation turned playful. Grace recounting a disastrous camping trip from her 20s. Complete with a tent collapse and a midnight downpour. While Ella shared her first design gig. A disastrous flyer for a bake sale that misspelled cupcakes as cupcakes. Laughter came easy. Bubbling up from the belly. And when it faded, Grace set her glass aside. Pulling Ella onto her lap with a grin that promised mischief. Their lovemaking was languid this time. Exploratory. Grace's fingers teasing patterns on Ella's thighs until she arched with a whimper. Then guiding her down. Mouths and hands a symphony of give and take. In the quiet after. As the fire died to embers. Grace traced the freckles across Ella's nose. Voice soft. "I used to think love was a solo hike. All independence and views for one." Ella smiled. Nuzzling into her neck. "Now it's shared trails." Sleep claimed them wrapped in each other. The cabin a cocoon against the vastness outside. San Francisco greeted them 3 days later. The Golden Gate a rust-orange span against bay fog. Traffic a snarl of horns and exhaust. They ditched the car in a lot near the Embarcadero. Boarding a cable car that clanged up Hyde Street. Wind whipping their hair as the city unfolded in Victorian layers. Grace's hand stayed firm in Ella's. A tether amid the jostle of tourists. And they disembarked at Lombard. The crookedest street a zigzag of hydrangeas in riotous bloom. Lunch was sourdough bowls of cioppino at a wharfside bistro. Crab and clams steaming in tomato broth. Napkins tucked into collars against the drip. They fed each other bites. Knees bumping under the table. The ferry horns from Alcatraz a mournful counterpoint. Afternoon brought Chinatown. Lanterns swaying red overhead. Dim sum devoured from steamer baskets in a cramped tea house where the air hummed with Cantonese chatter. Ella bought Grace a jade pendant from a stall piled high with trinkets. The stone cool and smooth as it settled against her collarbone. As evening fell, they climbed Coit Tower for the panorama. City lights winking on like a million fireflies. The bridges strung with necklaces of traffic. Grace leaned against the parapet. Pendant glinting. And pulled Ella close. "This trip. It's us." Unfolding. Ella nodded. Throat tight with the beauty of it. The ache of knowing roads ended but stories didn't. They kissed there. Salt-tanged and sure. The world sprawling below a testament to persistence. Back at their Airbnb in the Mission. A sunny flat with serapes on the walls and shelves of vinyl records. The night deepened into intimacy. They danced first. Barefoot to a Nina Simone album spinning lazy on the turntable. Bodies swaying in the pool of lamplight. Grace's hands on Ella's hips guiding the rhythm. It led to the bedroom. Clothes pooling on the floor. Skin flushed and seeking. Grace took her time. Lips and tongue a worship that left Ella boneless. then yielded with a vulnerability that stole breaths. Their union a cresting wave that crashed and receded in shudders. Lying spent amid rumpled linens, fingers tracing lazy paths, Ella voiced the question that had simmered since the redwoods. Ohio. When? Grace's arm tightened around her. After we get back. Labor Day. Give them time to adjust. The plan solidified in whispers. Details sketched like a new design. And sleep came with the comfort of commitment. But commitments tested metal. And the fracture widened on the drive home. I-5 a ribbon of asphalt through Central Valley heat. Grace's phone rang again. Her mother this time. And she answered on speaker. The car filling with hesitant pleasantries. Bringing someone, Grace said. Voice steady. Glancing at Ella with a small smile. Silence stretched. Then her mother's reply. Warm but wary. That's wonderful. Dear. Can't wait to meet her. The call ended. And relief washed over them. Tentative but real. They stopped in Sacramento for gas and grapes from a roadside stand. Juice bursting sweet on their tongues. And pressed on. The Cascades rising in the distance like a promise kept. Fall arrived back in Seattle with a crispness that sharpened the air. Leaves turning gold along the Burke-Gilman Trail where they jogged most mornings. Breaths puffing white in the chill. The road trip had woven them tighter. Scars shared and salved. But Ohio loomed now. A milestone marked on the calendar with equal parts dread and defiance. Ella threw herself into work. Pitching a series of illustrations for a queer-owned press. Her sketches alive with color and curve. While Grace prepped her syllabus for the new term. Lesson plans infused with a quiet fire. The weeks before departure flew. Packed with small rituals, Friday nights at a dive bar in Belltown. Pool cues clacking over cheap IPAs. Grace's competitive streak drawing laughs as she sank the 8-ball with a whoop. Weekends brought hikes in the Issaquah Alps. Summits conquered with sandwiches savored at the top. The city a toy sprawl below. Intimacy deepened in stolen moments. Grace's apartment a haven where they cooked risotto that stuck to the pan but tasted of effort. Or made love on the balcony under stars pricked through the overcast. Blankets muffling sighs against the neighbor's distant TV drone. Packing for the flight felt surreal. Suitcases zipped with care over wool sweaters and gifts wrapped in butcher paper, a handmade journal from Ella for Grace's mother. Filled with prompts for letters unsent. At the airport. SeaTax bustle a blur of rolling bags and announcements. They boarded hand in hand. The plane lifting them east over Rockies dusted white. Turbulence rattled the tray tables. But Grace's grip stayed firm. Her whisper in Ella's ear a anchor. We've got this. Cleveland touched down under a sky flat as slate. The lake effect promising snow by week's end. Grace's childhood home squatted in a suburb of tidy lawns and chain-link fences. The driveway cracked from winters past. Her parents waiting on the porch with hugs that enveloped like moth-eaten sweaters. Margaret, Grace's mother, was all soft edges and floral aprons. Her handshake for Ella warm but appraising. While Tom, the father, grunted a hello over a grill he tended year-round. His eyes crinkling in what might have been approval. The house smelled of pot roast and lemon polish. Walls lined with framed photos of Grace in pigtails and debate team ribbons faded yellow. Dinner unfolded in the dining room. Mismatched chairs scraping linoleum. Conversation skirting edges like a skittish horse. Margaret asked about Ella's work. Nodding over bites of carrots glazed sticky. While Tom shared stories of his days at the auto plant. Now retired to woodworking in the garage. Grace sat tense beside Ella. Foot tapping under the table. But as wine loosened tongues, the ice thawed. Margaret's laugh pealing when Ella recounted the redwood trip. The tent fiasco embellished for effect. Nights in the guest room brought closeness. Bodies curling under quilts stitched by Grace's grandmother. Whispers trading fears in the dark. They're trying, Grace murmured one evening. Head on Ella's chest. Heartbeat a steady drum. Ella stroked her hair. Silk under her fingers. And so are we. Mornings meant coffee on the back deck. Do beating the railing. Tom showing Ella his lathe-turned bowls while Margaret pulled Grace into the kitchen for pie crust lessons. Flour dusting their cheeks like conspirators. The barbecue arrived under a rare sun. Relatives arriving in waves with coolers of brats and coolers of beer. The yard filling with aunts in sundresses and cousins chasing frisbees across the grass. Ella manned the grill with Tom. flipping burgers with tongs that clattered like castanets. His gruff questions about Seattle drawing out tales of rain and innovation. Grace circulated, arm-length through Ella's when she could, introducing her as my partner with a chin lift that dared challenge. Whispers followed. Sidelong glances. But Margaret's arm around her shoulder silenced them. A quiet claim. As dusk fell, fireflies winking in the hedges, Grace pulled Ella aside to the old swing set. Chains creaking under their weight. You were perfect, she said. Voice thick. Ella leaned into her. The metal cool against her back. We were. The kiss that followed was fierce. A declaration. And when they rejoined the party, hands entwined, the world shifted just a fraction. Acceptance not thunderous but steady as the lake's lap at shore. The visit ended with promises renewed. Hugs at the airport that lingered. Margaret pressing a tin of cookies into Ella's hands. Tom's nod a benediction. Flying west. The plane banking over the Mississippi's muddy sprawl. Grace slept against Ella's shoulder. Breath even. And Ella watched clouds part to reveal the plains below. Vast and forgiving. Back in Seattle. The rain welcomed them with sheets that silvered the streets. Their apartments blending into one life. Keys exchanged and routines merged. Ella's illustrations sold. The book launch a cozy affair at a cafe in Fremont. Grace beaming from the front row as she signed copies. Their eyes meeting over the crowd with heat that promised later. Grace's classroom buzzed with a new energy. Mia's poetry blooming under her guidance. And she came home nights to Ella's sketches pinned like stars on the fridge. Winter settled soft. Holidays strung with lights along Queen and Avenue. Where they walked arm in arm. Breath fogging the air. Christmas Eve found them at a friend's potluck. Tables groaning under tamales and eggnog. Laughter echoing off exposed brick. Later. In bed with the tree's glow filtering through the door. They exchanged gifts unwrapped slow, a locket for Grace etched with coordinates of their first beach. A leather-bound journal for Ella filled with Grace's handwritten prompts. Their lovemaking that night was reverent. Bodies a language of gratitude. Grace's touch a vow renewed with every caress. Ella's responses a chorus of yes. In the hush after. As snow dusted the windowsill outside. Grace traced Ella's palm. Voice a murmur. That night you knocked. I was asleep. Dreaming of nothing. Now everything. Ella turned to her. Eyes tracing the beloved lines of her face. The freckles like constellations. And I was lost. Now found. They slept entwined. The city slumbering around them. And woke to a world remade in quiet wonders. Months turned to a year. The anniversary marked with a return to the coast. Highway 101 familiar as a lover's skin. They camped under stars uncountable. Fire building to flames that mirrored the one within. Stories swapped over Esmore's charred just right. Back home. Life layered on. Challenges met with hands clasped, Ella's freelance slump weathered with Grace's encouragement. A tenure scare at school navigated with Ella's steady presence. In the end, it was not grand gestures but the small ones that endured. The way Grace left notes in lunch bags. Quotes from Austen scrawled in looping script. Or how Ella brewed tea just so on nights when grading ran late. They talked still. Until morning when mornings allowed. Silence as comfortable as old jeans. Love, they learned, was not absence of storm but dancing in the rain. And in that dance, they found a humanism profound and simple, two souls. Scarred and whole. Choosing each other against the quiet vastness of the everyday.